Hello EPQ students, and welcome to this video which I'm calling Exploring the Artifact option. So what is it that I want to cover today? Well, I want you to explore really seriously the artifact option. I think it's richer in many ways. I think it's more interesting. I think it's more in keeping with many of the objectives of project-based learning. So I'm going to be covering why you might see this as a really sensible option. What are the criteria for a successful artifact? And then, just like this beautiful smorgasbord that we have here of delicious sandwich fillings, I want you to explore the myriad of choices available to you. And they really are a myriad. You can turn pretty much anything into an artifact, any particular subject. And in many cases, it's much better than actually writing a report based around a research question. Why is that? Well, it's quite often very difficult to come up with an answerable research question. And if that's the case, and you're really interested in an area, you might want to explore it from the point of view of an artifact. Now, we know there's a lot of bias in our education system against artifact learning. People often feel that you're less academic if you make something tangible, and that the literary essay or the academic report is the zenith of academic achievement. I don't really think that's true, and I think all you need to do is look at things like engineering, architecture, medicine, and many science degrees, where the artifact option is used a great deal and where project-based learning is the paradigm for really good education. So I think an artifact can be incredibly academic, and I think it can be very, very interesting. So it allows the development of practical or technical skills in a way that the essay or the report may not do so. It's particularly good if you want to apply your knowledge. And like I said, those fields of engineering, etc., where you really want to see how the academic learning will manifest in a physical, tangible situation, I think the artifact is absolutely amazing. The artifact really does support engagement and passion. The greatest EPQ projects for me have been students who have been absolutely absorbed by their projects, and that is almost always artifact projects. Not always, there are many amazing reports, especially when students combine them with primary research, but the artifact really does lend itself to primary research. So you can go out, you can interview people, you can draw, you can make plans, you can learn in the world. And that's what's so exciting about the artifact. And as I'll show you today, there are just so many creative outcomes. Another wonderful thing about the artifact is often they're incredibly interdisciplinary. So I have a student who's doing a brilliant documentary now in SeaWorld, for instance, and she's had to learn all about marine biology, how to interview people, how to make documentaries, how to do location shooting, etc. It's such an interdisciplinary and interesting artifact. So that really does lend itself to very sophisticated planning. I won't say too much about planning in this video because on my channel I've created another video on artifact planning, and it really is very complex. So in terms of becoming a really good project planner, I think the artifact option lends itself to some of the most sophisticated skills in that dimension. So what is the criteria for a successful artifact? Well, these are some of the things that you need to think about really carefully. You need an excellent research base, a very extended research base, a research base that is as impressive as a 5,000 word report. So that might take various forms. It might be literature, it might be journal articles, etc. But it may very well be interviews, forums, podcasts. It's different elements of primary research, experimentation, etc. It really is an interesting and highly expansive field. I think also you need to think about a creative and a critical response to something. How are you going to make something, and what are you making it for? You need a really clear purpose. The artifact must do something, even if it's a work of art, even if it's a novel. It needs to have a very clear purpose, and it needs to have a very clear audience, and possibly a context too. I'll be talking about that when I go through the various options now. You need an outcome that is suited to achieve its purpose. What do I mean by that? Well, the artifact needs to manifest in such a way that it can achieve its purpose. If you want to convince somebody of the importance of supporting the British military more, then it may be that you design a campaign with a fantastic speech, with all kinds of graphs and posters, etc. And that might be the best outcome in order to achieve your purpose, which is to encourage greater funding for the British military. There must be, following the creation of the artifact, rigorous evaluation. That must ascertain whether the artifact is fit for purpose. This is absolutely key. Does the artifact achieve what you said that it was going to do? And you must, in order to do that, have very clear success criteria. You have to decide how you're going to judge and measure. And then after that, you need to think really carefully about how you will analyze this feedback and present it. And in terms of your reflection, or your AO4 in the AQA mark scheme, you need to be able to talk about how that feedback made you think. And you need to do that in your report, in your presentation, and also in your project queue and the summary and reflection part of that. So what forms can an artifact take? Pretty much anything is the answer. It can be an object. I think students always think that it has to be a material thing, that it has to be three-dimensional, that it has to exist as a material object, but it doesn't. It can be an art piece, it can be a piece of furniture, but equally it can be a podcast, it can be a drama, it can be a film. I've had a beautiful dance one before that involved all sorts of complex choreography, etc. It can be part of a group project, but those are quite rare. It can be a project involving a significant amount of primary data. I had a brilliant artifact. I work in an international school with many students who would be called third culture kids who grow away from their home. And this particular student did an amazing piece, an amazing artifact in which she questioned all the students in different schools about elements of their identity and their sense of belonging, etc. And then she produced a magnificent artifact. So you have the opportunity of doing amazing primary source data, but you need to be very, very good at that and think about that really carefully. It can be an event, like a fashion show. It could be a club, and I've done I'm going to show you an amazing one of a student who put together an ECA. I've seen fashion shows, I've seen all kinds of ones. So there really are limitless ideas. So that's one of the things that can get you really excited, is you can think to yourself, what is the outcome that I want? And that outcome needs to be based on what it is you want to achieve and for whom you are designing the artifact. So I had an amazing EPQ artifact some years back, a student who created a Chinese New Year banquet. And in order to do this, they had to study the Chinese New Year history. They had to look at the mythology. They looked into the calligraphy, the decorations. They looked into elements of philosophy, ideas of yin and yang, and then, of course, the food itself to dish preparation. Now, the food and the philosophy of yin and yang often go together. So this was a fascinating project. And finally, the students set up the room according to the rules of feng shui, the Chinese idea that the entire way that you design things, where your windows are, where your doors are, where the wind blows, where the light comes in, all of these highly technical things are very important in terms of good fortune, etc. So this Chinese New Year banquet was an extraordinary project, and you can just see how much research, an enormous research base that went into this. And I think that's a wonderful one. Changing tack, a very different one, is a student of mine before who made a shovel electric guitar. Now, this came from the idea of his visits to Africa, where he saw that people were very interested in instruments, but guitars cost an absolute fortune. So he set himself an artifact project in which he wanted to produce a really low-cost instrument. And it was just a fantastic project, because look how careful and clear that purpose is, to produce a musical instrument for a developing world place with a small income. And in order to do this, he had to study, obviously, guitars, he had to study electrics, he had to look at musical theory. He's a guitarist himself, obviously. He had to look into the construction of it, so he had to learn how to do all sorts of tools and welding. He had to practice this guitar. He had to compare it to his original electric guitar. He practiced his performance. He did lots of pilots with other students listening to his guitar in order to evaluate the guitar and to decide whether it was fit for purpose. And it was a fantastic project, extremely interesting. You can see how happy he is playing his shovel guitar here. Now, I mentioned a moment ago, I had a student who came up with an amazing, amazing artifact project, where she recognized that there was a gap in our ECA market within our school. And she decided that for a term, she would create a manga ECA club for Key Stage 3 and 4. Before she did this, she completed market research and she found that there was a gap in the market. That's often a wonderful way of beginning an artifact project, because you can see where there is a need for something. This is a flyer that she sent out. So she organized all of the recruitment for the manga club. She analyzed all of her data and she ascertained that this club was definitely needed and it was going to work. She set about organizing the entire club. So the organizational skills here are phenomenal. Finding a room, finding a budget, contacting the director of our ECA program, advertising the club. And then the most extraordinary thing was to produce 14 different workshops. That's a term, our longest first term. She designed an entire manga program, which was absolutely extraordinary, varied, that involved learning about Japanese culture, the history of manga, how to draw, looking at familiar storylines and what's been successful. And then at the end of the ECA, she had a program evaluation by the students. And I can tell you it was an absolutely phenomenal artifact project that involved, as you can see, so many multiple skills. Now, here's a very different one. I used to teach this particular girl classical studies. She was going on to be an architect. She loved art. She was very interested in architecture and she was a brilliant mathematician. So what she decided to do was to create a digital reproduction of the temple of Zeus that had been destroyed. And as you can see here, as part of this, she learned how to do CAD. She'd had to do a lot of complicated mathematics as part of the research base. Remember how I said that artifacts are often highly interdisciplinary. And she also practiced drawing some of the statues that would have appeared there. Now, a lot of these designs that she created are from fragments. So she had to use a lot of her imagination. And then she set about producing the extraordinary CAD artifact, which was going to be used in my classical studies classroom. And I still use it now. So it's an extraordinary artifact that was brilliant, because in terms of the evaluation, I could use it as a teaching aid and she could get the evaluation both from me and from my students. And I can tell you, rather than having a 2D picture of the Temple of Zeus, being able to go inside this temple and to see what the statues look like and to get a sense of the scale, it was a brilliant artifact and highly effective. Moving on. This was another brilliant artifact project by a student who was an Egyptian girl. She entitled it Lego Blocks of Hope, Affordable and Sustainable Housing for Slum Upgrading in Egypt. Another brilliant project in which she went into Cairo. She looked at the spaces where affordable housing could be constructed. She looked at the different materials that could be used. She helped to test some of these materials. Again, someone who was very good at engineering, very good at physics and mathematics, so that her final design really was rigorously analyzed, and she used experts in architecture and town planning to assess her EPQ artifact. So it's a brilliant project that would go on to give you the kind of skills that would be extremely valuable for a career in architecture. Moving now to the arts. This was a wonderful project that was completed by a student, a music student in my school. It was entitled Around the World in 8 Minutes. And what she did was to get the idea of going around the world in 80 days. Some of you may know the story of Willie Fogg, who goes around the world in 80 days and uses a hot air balloon. In her particular project, she went around the world in 8 minutes, sampling different types of music from around the world and moving across the globe and plotting a very definite path. It was a huge research base and absolutely extraordinary. So the music would change as she went from China to Mongolia to Russia. And within 8 minutes, she covers, I think, 30 different sounds. So she had to use musical theory and scales. She had to learn programming of music using a software called Sibelius. And she had to engage in a very complex evaluation process with musical experts, because that was what was needed in order to ascertain that she had done this. So a complex one there, a difficult one. And you need to think really about which kind of people have the expertise and the ability and the judgment to decide whether your artifact is fit for purpose or not. Now, I also teach English literature and I love creative writing very much. This was a brilliant piece of creative writing, and I'm using it as an example because this is an example of a student who truly understands the artifact process. She understood that she needed a very tangible purpose for writing. She was fascinated by German history, and she loved the idea of the lost, the forgotten history of the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic, before Germany slides into the hideousness of Nazism, was a very culturally vibrant place, as we can see from this photo of a very famous film called Cabaret, loosely based on experiences of the Weimar Republic. So as she created her artifact novella, she describes it as creating a piece of writing that can change the minds of young adults towards the transition from Weimar to Nazi Germany. So she felt as though this history was lost. She was in a British curriculum school and felt that British students often stereotyped German people, etc., and had this kind of faulty view, a very generalized view of what the German character, German culture was. So she set out to change this and to make sure that students in her school had a richer appreciation of German history. Now, it was a brilliant artifact, and I think it was highly successful. The evaluation took into account the opinions of English teachers, a professional writer, and a historian. Again, a complex process of evaluation was needed for this particular artifact. Moving on. Now, a much more technical one was an artifact that was completed by a student recently in my school during COVID. He was very bored playing chess online. He liked the material chessboard and picking up and moving the pieces. So he created a robot arm so that he could play chess online that hooked up to his computer and would move the chess pieces according to the stated moves. This was a brilliant project, highly technical. It required knowledge of coding, of physics, of CAD, of lots of elements of construction. It took him a long time, and he had to work very hard on some of these pieces, even having to redesign the screws and repurpose them. So he developed this extraordinary research base. and had very highly specific success criteria, so that when it came to evaluation, it was very, very easy for him to determine whether his artifact was fit for purpose or not. So again, if you're a science student, you may not want to write a science essay. It may be that an artifact like this would actually test your intellectual skills and get you to apply a lot of the knowledge from maths or further maths, physics and computer science into something that is really innovative and creative, like this chess robot arm. Here is another brilliant scientific artifact project, this by a student who is very interested in medicine. Now, in our college, we have a lot of subject societies, like the medical society, we have a biology society, we have a technology society, politics society, etc. These can be brilliant groups in order to test an artifact. Now, the artifact could be something like a lecture, etc. But in this case, the student wanted an artifact to help future medics understand the human heart. And so you may not realize the complexity of this project. He had to study the heart in absolute depth. He met with cardiologists. He looked at MRI technology. He learned CAD and he learned laser printing and 3D printing in a great deal of detail and complexity. This first heart over here, rather large one, was his prototype to see if it was viable. And this was his final prototype, artifact, which was then tested both in a biology A-level classroom as a teaching aid and also as a teaching aid for our MedSoc, for our prospective doctors. So having a very concentrated, specific audience is one of the ways to make sure that the evaluation is rigorous and specific. And now a very different project. This is a girl in our college who travelled all the way to Kashmir, where she'd spent her early years but hadn't been for many years. She took on the role as a maths teacher, and to make matters tougher and worse, as you can see from these masks, it was during COVID. So she had to research maths teaching. Brilliant maths student herself, she had to now cater for students who found maths very difficult in a very rural and economically challenged school, as you can see. She also had to learn behavior management. She had to discuss lesson planning with her teachers and learning how to plan effective lessons, how to have good starters and plenaries and main activities, and how to build on learning and how to test prior learning, etc. As I say, COVID was another complicator, so she had to, factor that in. And at the end, she had to work out how she would get her lesson feedback from the students in order to evaluate whether her artifact was fit for purpose. Another extraordinary, imaginative, life-changing artifact project. So now to conclude, you really need a clear purpose for your artifact, a clear purpose and a specific audience in order to make the outcome measurable. Now, that doesn't always have to be in the form of figures. It doesn't have to be quantitative data. Of course, it can be qualitative data, but you have to convince the examiner that you have rigorously evaluated to see whether your artifact is fit for purpose or not. You need an extensive research base, and the artifact research base is so eclectic. It can be everything from experimenting with different tools to speaking to experts, to finding people online, to going to workshops. You really have the opportunity to network with experts. So many of my students use things like LinkedIn to source experts and to get extraordinary, interesting primary data. So you really need a very suitable outcome. I think it's better first to do the research before you think about the outcome, because the outcome might vary. And as the artifact project progresses, you might actually change the outcome slightly as you get deeper into the data. The key thing is to see whether it is fit for purpose. In terms of the construction, you need to think about the creativity and the acquisition of new skills. Can you do courses? How can you show that you are acquiring all these new skills? This is how you're going to get the AO3 mark for creativity, problem solving, for critical thinking, etc. You need to build in the idea of some kind of testing or pilot, like my human heart student did. You have to make sure that the project is feasible. I'm a great fan of the artifact projects, but if they're not carefully planned and thought out, they tend to be a disaster far more than the report stroke essay based projects. You need to think very carefully about the evaluation stage and making it specific, rigorous, and that you must produce enough data to show that this has been genuinely tested to see if it's fit for purpose. And finally, you need to complete an artifact project that really makes you reflect, AO4, that makes you think about everything that you've learned, that really makes for an interesting presentation, an interesting report, and a very interesting summary and reflection when you look across everything that you achieved as you finish the EPQ. I would like to end by saying that artifact projects can be absolutely magnificent, but they need very careful planning. So I suggest you watch my video on artifact planning and that you think very, very closely about how you will research, how you will construct, how you will evaluate. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that was useful.